Dynamic range is the difference between the lightest object and the darkest object your camera can record. An easy way to show this is by shooting an interior next to a window during the day. All right, so here we have a scene where we're shooting on an afternoon day. It's overcast outside, and we're shooting next to a window. Inside the room, there's only practical lights. So I have a ceiling fan with 4 fluorescent bulbs behind me, and then just to the left of my daughter here, I have 2 4-foot-long 32-watt tube-style fluorescent bulbs pointing up at the ceiling. And you can see it's not enough to properly expose the interior and match that for the exterior. This does look very natural, but we're not getting a great exposure here on the couch. Right now we're exposed for the outside. You can see there's a good amount of detail in the trees. We can see the leaves. And things are not too overexposed out there. So what we can do is raise the ISO on the camera so that we are properly exposing for the interior. Now this looks like a pretty good exposure on my daughter's face, maybe just even a little too hot. But the problem is the window is now completely overblown. It's a huge mess. You don't see any detail, just a blob of white. Our options in this type of situation without any additional lighting are either to expose for the outside if we wanted to get that in there, or we can expose for the inside. Now, this is maybe just a little bit extreme because, you could still see some detail at a lower exposure, but it wouldn't be a great exposure. So we can either expose for the window or we can expose for the room. Even if we crack the ISO down just a little bit to get just a little bit more detail in there and to pop the exposure down on the couch area just a little bit, we still don't have any details. I mean, the window just looks like a complete mess. And this is still on an overcast day, which is nothing compared to a bright sunny day. I mean, this is fairly dark outside. So now what we're going to do is we're going to lower the ISO down to expose for the window, and we're going to raise the ambient light in the room a good deal. Now look what we have. We have a really reasonable exposure on the subject, and we still have the same exposure in the window where we may lose just a hair of the detail over in the curtain area, but the outside window is really well controlled. This isn't what I would call great lighting because we're just basically boosting the ambient light in the room. What I'm using here is 2 fixtures. Each one of them has 220 watts of fluorescent light. So that's probably the equivalent of maybe a 900 watt tungsten fixture. So I'm using 2 of those. In addition to those, I'm using another fluorescent unit that has the equivalent output of around 1,000 watts of tungsten power, maybe a little bit more. It's using 2 85 watt CFLs and 2 45 watt CFLs with no light modifier, just bare bulbs, and they're really high in the room with a white ceiling. You can see we've drastically changed the exposure in the room so that we can correctly expose for the couch area. You can see the blacks still look black, and nothing has really changed in the window other than the curtains. You get a little bit more kind of ambient light boost. Now, this might not look super natural, but depending on the situation, you can balance the outside light to the interior light. Now, if this was on a bright sunny day, this would look a good bit more natural because the window would be pumped up even more. So if we had to stop down our camera a little bit so that we could properly expose the window, we'd still have kind of a natural, outside way brighter than inside type of look. And that would be appropriate because usually windows are a little bit brighter. And so that would work very well. But as it is, we were able to kind of balance and almost match the amount of light from the outside during this time of day to the inside of the room. Different cameras will have different dynamic ranges. Generally, less expensive cameras have much less dynamic range, and ultra high-end cinema cameras have a lot. Let's look at the same shot with an iPhone. All right, now we're looking at the same exact scene, this time recorded with an iPhone camera. Specifically, it's an iPhone 4. Right now, I have adjusted the exposure as best I can for the window, like we had done before. iPhone controls are not that precise, so this is as close as I can get it. Now, watch what happens when I try and expose for even this gray blanket here. The window completely gets blown out much faster than on the other camera. Now, if we try to boost the exposure even more to really get a proper exposure for this blanket and the face, the window gets even more blown out. it's still not as bumped up as we had it on our other camera. You can see that the blanket is still largely dark. There's not a lot of details. It looks almost black in areas when it's supposed to be brown. So now we're going to do the same thing as before, where we knock the exposure back down for the window, and then we boost up the ambient light just as before. And we're going to see what this looks like. Now you can see we have a more balanced exposure on here. The dark things still look dark and the bright things still look bright, but now we get a lot better exposure for the area that's happening on the couch here. And if we boost the exposure just a little bit more to try and kind of expose my daughter here on the couch, the window does get blown out faster. And this shows you that, this exposure is pretty close to where we had it before on the other camera, but the window is blowing out faster. So this camera is going to have less dynamic range. Even though this is better than what we had when we started, this is definitely not as good as a camera that has higher dynamic range. Because in order, even though we're keeping the window relatively exposed well, you can see that the blanket is still very, very dark. We're not getting a lot of detail there. Now it's partially due to the codec and the way it's compressed in the camera. It's, pretty contrasty, but you can see the skin tones are fairly close. They could be a little bit brighter. In order to get this to more closely match the other camera, we'd have to increase the ambient light even more than it is now in order to really, really bring up the levels in the room to more evenly match the levels that we're getting outside. Or instead of doing something like this, where instead of kind of boosting the general light in the room where it's all pretty non-directional, what we can do is just hammer the light right on the subject. So I'll reposition these lights here, bump the camera a little bit, and now we are getting a slightly better exposure on the couch, although we've kind of lost the super soft light that we had before by bouncing it up off the ceiling, and now it's just direct on the subject, which is still a little bit soft because these are big lighting units, but you can see it's not as natural as kind of the super soft wash light that we had before. But this gives you a little bit better exposure on the couch, and this more closely matches what we were looking at before with the other camera. This is really important because we can use lighting not only to get a proper exposure, but to compensate for the camera's lack of dynamic range. For the iPhone, we can expose for the brightest area and then bring up the ambient light in the room until we are seeing all the detail that we want in the darker areas. How much we will have to bring the ambient lighting up in the room depends on the camera's dynamic range and what we are looking for to see in the final picture.